This one?
I'm good.
Rolling.
We're on.
We are live.
Good
Okay.
evening. My name is Robert Damas. Thank you all for coming this evening. Topic is the Kishinev Pogrom of 1903. Chaim Nachman Bialik, Michael David. We will explain who he is in a minute. And a tale of two pogroms. Hashemesh zarcha, hashita parcha, v'hashochet shachat. The sun was shining, the rye blossomed, and the slayer slew. So Bialik presents this powerful image of an event that riveted the world's attention. Beginning on Easter Sunday in April 1903, but dramatically escalating during the following 2 days, the city of Kishinev was swept by a pogrom that resulted in 49 deaths, 92 people gravely injured, and innumerable rapes, and the destruction of an estimated 2,800 homes and businesses. More than 2 months after the pogrom, 10,000 Jews were still homeless and dependent on relief they were receiving from the Central Relief Committee of Kishinev. The Kishinev pogrom had an outsized impact on the Jewish world, an event later described as the pogrom that transformed 20th century Jewry. This evening, we will explore why the Kishinev pogrom was a seminal event for world Jewry, how it radicalized Jewish youth in Russia, its impact on American Jews, and its impact on the development of Zionist ideology. We will also examine the role of Chaim Nachman Bialik and Zev Jabotinsky in disseminating their story of what happened in Kishinev, and the impact that the pogrom, and especially Bialik's poem, Be'ir HaHariga, in the city of slaughter, had on their lives and thinking. We will also look at the great impact on world public opinion of Michael David, a well-known Irish journalist and naturalist, who was hired by William Randolph Hearst to report on the pogrom, and who was the author of Within the Pale, The True Story of Anti-Semitic Persecution in Russia, which was published several months after the pogrom. To begin, where is Kishinev? Kishinev was the capital of the Russian province of Bessarabia, located about 100 miles northwest of Odessa. Today, Bessarabia is the independent country of Moldova, bordering on Romania and the Ukraine. In 1903, Kishinev was the 5th most populous city in Russia, with a population approximating 110,000, of which an estimated 45% were Jewish. The province was a sleepy backwater with little in the way of commerce or industry beyond agricultural produce, principally corn and wheat, flour, wine, brandy, and timber. Much of the trading in agricultural produce was handled by Jewish middlemen who went out to the provincial farms and purchased from the farmers their crops. The outsized role of Jews surrounding Kishinev, as well as their very visible role as shopkeepers and artisans in the city, was certainly contributing factors to the virulent anti-Semitism that existed and which was to fuel the savagery of the pogrom. The events in Kishinev brought to the world the word pogrom. It is a Russian word meaning to destroy by the use of violence. What distinguishes a pogrom from a massacre is the involvement of government forces in actively organizing or otherwise abetting the riots and the killings. That the Tsarist administration had a role in facilitating the Kishinev pogrom is clear, but the extent of that role is not. The Kishinev pogrom of 1903 was not the first, nor unfortunately the last pogrom. Following the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881, Jews were blamed for the anarchy, socialist movements, and anti-Tsarist activities that were spreading in Russia. The government encouraged the pogroms that then took place, but these events involved primarily the destruction of property, the beating of individuals, and rape. Few people were killed. The New York Times reported on January 28, 1882, in an article entitled Russian Jewish Horrors, a 9-month record of rape, murder, and outrage, that at least 40 Jews were killed during pogroms between April and December 1881. These pogroms had an immediate impact on the founding of the Bilu movement and the emigration of several thousand young Jewish pioneers to Palestine, and they sparked a near exodus of an estimated 500,000 Jews to America in the years 1881 to 1903. But the Kishinev pogrom of 1903 was different. Kishinev came as a surprise, if only because it was the first major outbreak of violence in almost 20 years. It was also the first pogrom to take place in the 20th century. Importantly, it was the first time that the aftermath of a pogrom had been photographed. Dead bodies, destroyed homes and businesses appeared in dozens of newspapers in the United States, Europe, and elsewhere, and galvanized readers. The New York Times and the Times of London had a reciprocal agreement for the exchange of news stories, and as a result, the New York Times published many eyewitness accounts and photographs, as well as reprinting news articles first appearing in the Yiddish press. The world press made the Kishinev pogrom the cause célèbre of the new 20th century. Cecil Roth, a noted historian, reported in his History of the Jews, on April 19, 1903, there was a fresh outbreak at Kishinev, which outdid in sheer savagery any of those which had preceded it, and obviously took place as a result of semi-official encouragement, if not organization. It was only after the conscience of Europe had been shocked by 3 days of continuous rioting, accompanied by much bloodshed, that orders arrived from St. Petersburg to restore peace. Sheer savagery that had not been experienced by the Jews since 1648 in the Khmelnytsky uprising. Michael David, in his book published soon after the pogrom, cited the following examples of such savagery: driving the nails into the eyes of a woman, cutting out the tongue of a living 2-year-old child, and nameless sexual mutilations so horribly familiar to us from the events on October 7th. The period 1905 to 1921 experienced hundreds of well-documented pogroms reported in international newspapers of the day that took place in Russia and in the Ukraine, where in excess of 100,000 Jews were slaughtered. In contrast, the pogrom in Kishinev in 1903 lasted only 3 days and killed only 49 Jews. Why is the Kishinev pogrom, with its limited number of casualties, remembered, while the horrors of the Ukrainian pogroms, which were widely reported in the international press, and with its massive number of casualties, largely forgotten? In many respects, it was the harrowing front-page reports of David and the poetry of Bialik that indelibly etched Kishinev into the world's collective memory and made Kishinev synonymous with Jewish tragedy and suffering prior to the Holocaust. The pogrom itself began on Easter Sunday, April 19, 1903, which coincided with the 7th day of Passover. The outbreak started as a mild disturbance by rowdy children and teenagers with limited damage to person and property during its first hours. But by 4 p.m., the crowd of rioters had grown. Liquor stores owned by Jews, and by the way, almost all the liquor stores were owned by Jews, were ransacked, and the drunken mob led by seminarians began to attack Jews and to break into Jewish homes with cries of death to Jews and with claims that Jews had killed a local priest. Others claimed that a Jew had knocked down a Christian woman and her infant. On that first day, there was wide-scale plunder and attacks on Jews, and as the evening came, the wide-scale rape of women. Michael David reported of a woman who was raped the first night repeatedly for 4 hours by members of a mob which included seminarians. By this point, the police had arrested 60 rioters. By the second day, that number would exceed 900. Monday morning dawned on a balmy day. Gangs of 10 or 20 men armed with hatchets and knives stormed into courtyards, attacking the women and girls. Jewish men who tried to protect the women were beaten senseless or murdered. Most Jews murdered in the pogrom, which at first were erroneously reported in the press to be in the hundreds, took place on Monday between late morning and mid-afternoon. During the course of Monday and the next day, the violence escalated in intensity and savagery. While the physical assaults were going on, others, including well-dressed Gentile women, ransacked the Jewish shops on the major streets, carting off goods in their arms, and enterprising individuals brought in wagons to assist in the plunder. By late morning, nearly the entire center of the city was enveloped by violence and the Jewish shops gutted. Israel Rossman, a shop owner interviewed by Bialik, testified that on Sunday, a gang of about 50 ruffians, both men and women, went about smashing windows and breaking into shops on the street. They were followed by a contingent of police that did nothing to stop the gang. It will never be known how many women and girls were raped over the course of the pogrom. Many women would not report the assaults for fear of losing husbands to divorce, or if unmarried, losing the opportunity to wed. One 24-year-old married victim gave her detailed and disturbing testimony to Bialik and later to David of being repeatedly raped together with another young woman by different gangs of men, first by 7 men, and after having been seemingly rescued, they were then raped by other men. The rapes that occurred were well known in Kishinev, but these attacks were ignored in the post-pogrom trials. It should be noted that Jews were not shot by the mobs. The killing that took place was upfront in person. Jews were bludgeoned to death with poles or stabbed to death with knives. In some instances, they were thrown out of windows or hacked to death with axes, or as David noted in his book, horrifically mutilated. Often the violence was perpetrated by neighbors living in the same courtyard. Ironically, one story that gained great prominence in the West was the martyrdom of Moshe Kegel, described as the devout shamash of a shul who rushed in to save the Torah scrolls of a synagogue, wrapped in his talit and tefillin. Portraits of Kegel were widely printed, poems, plays, and even prayers were dedicated to him in the United States. It is unclear how this medieval-esque tale of martyrdom started, but in fact, Kegel was not the shamash of his shul. He was not murdered in the shul. He was not wearing talit and tefillin, and he was not attempting to protect the Sifrei Torah when killed. He was simply one of the 49 martyrs. It was only late in the afternoon on the second day of the pogrom that the provincial governor Rab authorized the 6 army units stationed in Kishinev to control the mob. But it was not until 6 p.m. that the army began to arrest around 500 rioters in the city center. The resultant part was quashing the rioting in the city center, but also in the movement of many of the rioters to Old Town, where there was no militia, and which then became the epicenter of the mob's fury on Monday evening and on Tuesday, when the pogrom was finally extinguished. News of the pogrom taking place in Kishinev was telegraphed out to Odessa, and from there to Russian Jewish newspapers, finally making its way in real time to newspapers in world capitals. The world outcry which ensued led to Bialik and David being sent to Kishinev to chronicle the events, each of whom contributed in very different ways to what made this pogrom indelibly etched in Jewish memory. Chaim Nachman Bialik was a rising star in Jewish intellectual circles in Odessa, already established as a first-rate Hebrew poet. A month and a half after the pogrom, he was dispatched to Kishinev by Simon Dubno, the renowned historian and head of the Jewish Historical Commission in Odessa, to gather evidence and prepare a systematic report of his findings. Bialik went house to house over a 5-week period, interviewing survivors, and filled 5 notebooks with detailed testimonies of violence. Having done so, he then decided to set those notebooks aside, ultimately hiding them. And he did not write or submit a report to the Jewish Historical Commission. Rather, he proceeded to write his epic poem that became a powerful influence on fixing the centrality of the Kishinev pogrom on Jewish thought. Be'ir HaHariga in the city of slaughter has been described as both the most influential, if not the finest Hebrew poem written since medieval times. In fact, the poem was part of the Israeli literary canon, and until the 1970s was a mainstay of Israel's school curriculum. With this poem, the reputation of Bialik soared. The poem took Bialik 4 months to compose and was published on November 27, 1903, in the St. Petersburg Hebrew newspaper Hazman. Zev Jabotinsky almost immediately translated the poem into Russian and Yud Lamed Peretz into Yiddish, thereby allowing it to reach a very large audience. Jabotinsky's translation helped to make him known far beyond the confines of Odessa and Jewish intelligentsia. Ultimately, the poem was translated from the Russian into English and other languages and gained worldwide distribution and impact. The poem dramatically takes the reader by the hand and walks you through the pogrom street by street, courtyard by courtyard, and building by building. In certain respects, a travelogue of a massacre. Be'ir HaHariga opens biblically with Kum, Lech Lecha El Ir HaHariga, rise, go to the city of slaughter, and continues, and with your eyes see and with your hands feel. Bialik transforms the reader into a witness to later direct their shock and grief into rage against the Jews' weakness. Be'ir Hariga was the second poem addressed by Bialik to the Kishinev Pogrom. The first was Al Hashchita, upon the slaughter, which was written immediately after news of the massacre reached Odessa and before Bialik had traveled to Kishinev to investigate what had transpired. Al Hashchita was sympathetic to the victims of the pogrom, so one must ask why Bialik's second poem focused much of his anger on the reported passivity of Jews in the face of the mobs, and why he chose to ignore Jewish heroism, the men who were butchered trying to defend their women and Jewish defense efforts at self-defense. Why was Bialik's retelling so different from that of Michael David? Why did Bialik keep concealed from the public his extensive and detailed notes and interviews with survivors of the pogrom, notes he buried with his unpublished materials that were not made available to the public until 1991? Bialik's condemnation of the victims required a radical rewriting of the evidence which he compiled. In fact, it required him to hide evidence to allow him to push a political narrative of Zionism's new man capable of self-defense. Be'ir Hariga should be read as a political manifesto and not as a historic report of the actual events. And this manipulation of events had an overwhelming effect on Jewish political discourse and in advancing his political agenda in favor of Jewish self-defense. Jabotinsky also went to Kishinev in the immediate aftermath of the pogrom as a journalist and also interviewed survivors and was presumably aware of Jewish attempts at self-defense thwarted by the Russian police. Jabotinsky did not discuss this or raise the issue when he translates Bialik's poem from Hebrew to Russian. Max Diman, writing in the 1960s in his study, Jews, God, and History, claimed that this poem caused thousands of Jewish youth to cast off their pacifism and join the Russian underground to fight Tsar and tyranny. The poem emerged as a clarion call for Jewish activity of all stripes, Jewish self-defense in Russia, Jewish socialists, and in Palestine in later times as the issue developed. It spoke as strongly to members of the Bund, the General Jewish Workers' Union, dedicated to resistance to the Tsarist regime, as it did to Zionists seeking to formulate a new national ethos. Above all, it was the spark that led to almost 1,500,000 Jews fleeing to America in the period 1903 to 1914. Were it not for Bialik's poem, The Kishinev Pogrom, might have sunk into the abyss of 20th century Jewish suffering. Whatever the poem was, it was not history. When read in conjunction with the newspaper reportage of journalist Michael David, and in his later book Within the Pale, we see a tale of two different pogroms. Bialik's of Jews going like the proverbial lambs to the slaughter, of men hiding under benches and behind barrels witnessing the rapes, contrasted with David's tale of Jewish men standing between the mob and their women and valiantly seeking to defend them while being butchered by the mob. A critical question is, why was Kishinev in 1903 torn apart by a pogrom after 20 years of quiet? The pogrom did not come out of the blue, although nobody could have anticipated the level of savagery that happened. Throughout the month preceding Easter, hostility toward the Jews had grown after a Ukrainian boy, Mikhail Rybashenko, was found murdered in a town about 25 miles north of Kishinev, and a Christian girl was pronounced dead in a Jewish hospital. Although Russian authorities caught the murderer, who was the boy's uncle, and the girl was determined to have committed suicide, there was a widespread belief that both children had been murdered by the Jewish community for the purpose of using their blood for matzot on Pesach. One circular that was widely distributed read, "A great festival of the resurrection of Christ draws near. The vile Jews are not content with having shed the blood of our Savior whom they crucified. Every year they shed the innocent blood of Christians and use it in their rites. They aspire to seize our beloved Russia. They incite against the authorities, even against our little father, the Tsar. Brothers, we need your help. Let us massacre the vile Jews." Michael David, in a dispatch to the Hearst newspapers on June 3rd, 1903, noted that the origin of the pogrom was the virulently anti-Semitic newspaper Bisarabits, and its false claims that the Jews had ritually murdered a young boy and girl and summoned the Russian Christians to punish the Jews. The chief rabbi of Kishinev hastened to the Greek bishop, who refused to intervene and make an episcopal assurance that such ritual murders had not taken place. 10 days before the start of the riots, various Jewish leaders visited the governor of the province and warned him of the feared pogrom. General von Waben assured the deputation that all necessary precautions would be taken, but nothing was done. Davitt went on to expressly blame Pavel Khrushchevin, the publisher of Bessarabets, for fomenting the pogrom. Khrushchevin, a virulent anti-Semite, regularly published in his newspaper articles with headlines such as "Death to the Jews" and "Crusade against the Hated Race," and raising charges of Jewish economic exploitation and daily trumpeted charges of ritual murder, even after Russian authorities had dismissed them as unfounded. As a footnote, in September 1903, Khrushchevin co-authored and published the first draft of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. One cannot ignore the role of the church in the pogrom. David noted in his book that the actual leaders of the riots were students and seminarists from the Royal School and from 6 of the city's religious colleges. The seminarists directed the movements of the mobs. The rioters comprised 30 bands averaging 50 each, with the seminarist on a bicycle directing the attack. David further noted that during the progress of the first day's outrages, the Bishop of Kishinev, while on his way to dinner, gave his blessing to the rioting crowd. A significant issue which was raised at the time was the role of the Tsarist administration in the pogrom. The failure of the Tsarist administration to promptly and decisively put down the rioting almost immediately became reported as imperial Russian brutality against its Jews. The answer in part to this question appeared in print. In May 1903, the Times of London published a letter dated March 25th, 3 weeks before the pogrom, purportedly from Minister of the Interior Plevy to the governor of Bessarabia, directing the governor not to use force to stop the rioting once it erupted, leading to widely reported claims that officials in Kishinev acted in collusion or negligence or turned a blind eye to the impending pogrom. The Times of London, in a December 7, 1903 article, discussed the Tsarist government's complicity and noted, once the authorities finally intervene only on the morning of the 3rd day, fear of any reprisal has evaporated, and rape and murder are now commonplace. All of this from the very first pebble thrown by a small boy to the last murder committed is absolutely under the control of the government. Davitt reported that all the evidence that I have gathered during 8 days of search and inquiry in Kishinev convinces me that the riots were not a casual or accidental uprising of a mob against the Jews, but formed a carefully planned attack by the local anti-Semitic leaders with the passive connivance of the chief of police and the active encouragement of some of his officers. Von Waben's deplorable weakness in not employing his military force to quell the riots during the first day is responsible for the horrors of that and the massacres and the violations of women and girls on the second day. David documented his conclusion of government collusion as seen through the refusal of police and military to intervene, noting at page 195, during the first day of the pogrom, Governor von Waben failed to issue orders of any kind, either to the police or military. He noted a Jewish rape victim managed to get free and fled to a nearby police station begging for police help. She was driven from the station with the words, "The Jews are only getting what they deserve." David identified the woman as Chana Zaychik and the police officer as Officer Moretsky. He talks about Seltzer's daughter rushed to the police station asking for help. The police replied, "We shall do nothing." He noted Assistant Police Officer Gorosansk twice passed by the scene of rioting on Gostanaya Street, where a father and son were butchered by the mob and did nothing. When the Jews went to the police station for help, the inspector replied, "Serves you right, why do you use our blood?" The wife of Solomon Fishman and a 10-month-old son were killed, while the superintendent of the police, Christoph Solovkin, looked on unmoved. The general response of the Tsarist government to international condemnation was that the Jews were responsible for the riots, of course. In an interview on May 18, 1903, the Russian ambassador to the United States, Count Arthur Cassini, claimed that the pogrom was a reaction of financially hard-pressed peasants to Jewish creditors. It is the peasant against the moneylender. There is no feeling against the Jew in Russia because of religion. The Jew ruins the peasants. Conflicts occur when the latter have lost all their worldly possessions. The official explanation made by the Tsarist government was made by Minister of the Interior Plevy, which was published in the Times of London on June 13, 1903, a copy of which we handed out. By the way, we faithfully transcribed the errors in syntax, usage, and grammar if you read it. It's a little hard to read, but you can understand what they were trying to say. Plevy essentially blamed the Jews for the pogrom, made no mention of rapes or even of murders, nor did he even discuss the third day of rioting. Michael David's book, Within the Pale, gives specific evidence to refute each of the claimed excuses and to establish their falsehood. Notably, Plevy claimed that the initial cause of the riots was an assault by the Jewish owner of a merry-go-round in the square in front of the cathedral on a Christian woman knocking her and her baby to the ground. David reported that he found the proprietor of the merry-go-round, who was Christian of German nationality. The proprietor stated that no Christian or other woman was struck by any Jew, and that neither he nor any of his employees had hit anyone. Plevy claimed that the pogrom was a spontaneous act of the mob after the Christian woman was hit. David discusses how the pogrom was a result of planning and premeditation by anti-Semites and seminarians. Footnote, Plevy was assassinated in 1905 by social revolutionary, in part for his role in not putting down the pogrom. Of interest is that Maxim Gorky and Leo Tolstoy wrote condemnations blaming the Russian government for the pogrom. Tolstoy then collaborated with Sholem Aleichem to produce an anthology dedicated to the victims, with all proceeds going to a relief fund. Important to keep in mind was that the pogrom was not taking place in a vacuum. The access of journalists to Kishinev and the role of international communications brought the pogrom to millions of newspaper readers in almost real-time reportage. The William Randolph Hearst newspaper empire embraced the Kishinev pogrom as a crusade, highlighting it with the use of photography. Most famously, the widely reprinted photograph of 45 shrouded Jewish dead stretched out on the floor of the Kishinev Jewish Hospital, coupled with the harrowing reports on its front pages sent by Michael David. In New York, Jews waited outside the offices of Hearst New York American for the posting of the latest reports from Kishinev by David. David's widely read reports catapulted him to international fame. His book, published in December 1903, was an instant success, so much so that the Jewish Publication Society obtained the rights to reissue it under its own imprint. No Jewish event of the time would be as extensively documented. There was a cascade of information as never before, amassed by teams of reporters, by Jewish activists, political radicals, well-known writers, and philanthropists in the months following the pogrom. The pogrom dominated the headlines of American newspapers for weeks. You should know that during the Holocaust, the New York Times only 24 times from the Kristallnacht from 1945 had any stories about the Holocaust on its front page, and more than half the time, it didn't mention that the victims were Jews. On May 28, 1903, the New York Times published a report smuggled out of Russia under the headline, "Jewish Massacre Denounced." The report read, there was a well-laid-out plan for the general massacre of Jews on the day following the Russian Easter. The mob was led by priests, and the general cry, "Kill the Jews," was taken up all over the city. The Jews were taken wholly unaware and were slaughtered like sheep. The dead numbered 120 and the injured about 500. It goes on and on. Most of these facts were wrong, but at least they reported. At least they reported it. They also make note here there was a popular belief among Russian peasants that the Tsar decreed the slaughtering of Jews. Representative of the American press was an editorial in the Atlanta Journal on May 29, 1903, which noted, "We think that the time has come when civilized people everywhere, Christians and Jews, should unite in one voice of disapproval against the Tsar and his ministers for these shameless crimes. It is not a few ignorant ruffians in Bessarabia who are on trial today. It is a national government. The criminals who have been hauled before the world's bar of justice are from St. Petersburg, as well as from Kishinev." Amid a cacophony of outrage, instant relief projects and protest meetings in more than a dozen countries, Kishinev's pogrom became a stand-in for evil. The shock that such medieval-like butchery, and these terms were repeatedly recycled at the time, had intruded on the dawn of the new century. There was a tremendous outpouring of financial relief that flowed from both the Jewish and Gentile international community, aid that was documented by the Kishinev Relief Committee and set forth as an appendix in David's book. The persecution of Jews in Russia following the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881 generated a groundswell of sympathy for their plight in America. So much so that in 1892, the platforms of both the Democratic and Republican parties expressly denounced Russian persecution of the Jewish population. With this background, when news of the Kishinev Pogrom made front-page news in America, particularly the almost daily harrowing reports of Michael David in the Hearst newspapers, the plight of the Jews found an outraged American audience. An example of American sympathy can be seen in the book by William Curtis Stiles, published in June 1903, entitled Out of Kishinev, The Duty of the American People to the Russian Jews. This book, published weeks after the pogrom, sets forth a compelling historical account of Russia's tragic persecution of its Jews and further details accounts of the Kishinev Pogrom. The American response took the form of political protests and campaigns in the press, financial aid, support for the American Zionist movement, and support for Jewish immigration. Almost immediately after reports of the pogrom had reached the United States, the State Department made an official inquiry to St. Petersburg expressing concern. The Russian response was, "It is authoritatively denied that there is any want or suffering among Jews in southwestern Russia." Further, Russia objected to the U.S. inquiry, stating forcefully that the U.S. had no right to interfere in internal Russian affairs, just as Russia didn't have a right to interfere with what was going on with the Negroes down south. During the 3 months following the pogrom, more than 200 protests were held in 27 states, even in cities with a negligible Jewish presence, such as Asheville, North Carolina, and Chautauqua, New York. These protest meetings were fueled by newspaper stories and editorials, and by sermons from the pulpits of a myriad of churches. The largest of these meetings was held in New York City at Carnegie Hall on May 27, chaired by Mayor Seth Low, and with former President Grover Cleveland as the principal speaker. The mass protest and widely shared belief in the complicity of the Tsarist government in the persecutions contributed to blocking any attempts to restrict Jewish immigration. That was a positive thing that came out of the pogrom. Led by Oscar Strauss, Jacob Schiff, Maya Sulzberger, and Rabbi Stephen Weiss, the national protest led to a meeting with President Teddy Roosevelt and Secretary of State John Hay. The pogrom had a major impact on New York City's Jewish community, which embraced Kishinev as its major concern and propelled the Yiddish Daily forward from a small newspaper into a long-lasting, prominent newspaper. In response to the events in Kishinev and the reports, especially of Michael David, that the Jews in southwestern Russia were in fear of fresh outbreaks of violence, a petition was circulated directed to the Tsar, urging him to admonish Russian local officials to strenuously extend protection to the Jews. This petition was signed by over 15,000 people, including many non-Jewish dignitaries, and was presented to President Roosevelt. The president directed the American charge d'affaires in St. Petersburg meet with the Russian foreign minister and advised him that the president requested that the petition from a large number of citizens of the United States of all religious affiliations and occupying the highest positions in both public and private life be presented personally to the Tsar for his consideration. On July 18, 1903, the New York Times reported that the Secretary of State advised the public that the Russian government refused, under any circumstances, to present the petition to the Tsar for his consideration, nor would the government even accept receipt of the petition. The Times reprinted the Secretary's lengthy and strongly worded direction to the American charge d'affaires, outlining the persecution of Jews and how the cruel outrages perpetrated at Kishinev excited horror and reprobation throughout the world. In an effort to improve American-Russian relations, Russia's ambassador in Washington visited with President Roosevelt and reported that the governor of Bessarabia had been replaced and that over 300 of those who participated in the pogrom and were arrested would be tried and punished, quote, to the full extent of the law. Just what was meant by Russian punishment to the full extent of the law, there were secret trials. One Russian was sentenced to 7 years in prison, one was sentenced to 5 years in prison, and 22 were sentenced to 1 to 2 years in prison. 900 were released after several weeks of detention before charges against them were dropped. No one was convicted of murder, no one was convicted of rape, although the names of the murderers and rapists were often known to the victims and to the authorities. The New York Jewish community established almost immediately the Kishinev Relief Committee. All of the New York Yiddish newspapers began fundraising campaigns, and by May 8th, $10,000 was raised. Notably, the newspapers of William Randolph Hearst in New York, Chicago, and San Francisco raised over $50,000, which is an awesome sum of money. This is $1903, which was forwarded to the Kishinev Relief Committee. There were benefit theatrical performance and concerts across America to raise money. Even the Chinese community sponsored benefit performances in Chinese. Many Christian politicians and religious leaders participated, perhaps most notably Secretary of State John Hay, who donated $500, which in today's dollars would be $18,265. These fundraising efforts were not limited to America, and the Kishinev Relief Fund reported that by January 25, 1904, it had dispersed approximately $500,000 of relief. Beyond general appeals for relief, Michael Davitt set forth the following appeal for orphans and women raped in his dispatch to the Hearst newspapers on May 27, 1903. I quote, "I desire to appeal most urgently for assistance for the future of the girls and married women who were savagely violated during the riots at Easter. These girls have no hope now of marriage where the facts of their dishonor are publicly known." He discusses women whose husbands divorced them. Their misfortunes, along with those of the young girls referred to, make a peculiarly pathetic appeal to the sympathy of those who might be blessed with the means by which the future of these unhappy creatures might be made less miserable and hopeless. There are also 50 to 100 orphans, children of murdered fathers and mothers, who ought to be provided for. At the time of the pogrom, the Federation of American Zionists was struggling to survive. It was small in number and not supported by the Jewish establishment, led by wealthy German Jewish leaders. Professor Gottal of Columbia University took a leading role in both organizing financial relief, but importantly tried to harness the Kishinev Pogrom to serve the Zionist case, arguing in June 1903, the only solution for Jews was a safe and secure homeland of their own. The pogrom helped the American Zionist movement to attract new adherents and to begin to grow, ultimately attracting national leaders such as Supreme Court Justice Louis D. Brandeis and later on Felix Frankfurter. An interesting plea for Zionism came from Michael Davitt in his book Within the Pale, where he sets forth his message of a catastrophic future for the Jews of Russia and the need for them to emigrate. Pale, a convinced believer in the remedy of Zionism. I fail to see any other that can offer an equal hope of success. It is a necessity of the actual situation and faces the growing perils of the position of the Russian Jew with a continuous plan of repatriation. Hope for partial or ultimate emancipation in Russia is none. Other countries cannot be expected to relieve Russia of the unhappy victims of oppression and poverty. Where are they to go? The tale of two pogroms is a tale of self-defense. Bialik chose to purposely ignore the evidence of many efforts of self-defense that he personally had chronicled and detailed in his unpublished notes. His poems avoid any reference to the heroism and self-defense that was attempted in a purposeful effort to blur acts that would diminish his political message of the passivity and helplessness of the Jew. Be'er HaHariga became a symbol for the vulnerability of the Jewish people in exile. Yet Michael David reported various efforts by Jews to defend themselves, noting, for example, at number 13 Asia Street, the mob attacked the Jews living there and trapped 16 women and girls in the building's loft. 4 Jewish men tried to defend the place and were murdered. Their wives and daughters who had survived the ensuing mass rape gave testimony to David of this brave sacrifice. David also attests to another location where 5 men were killed trying to defend their wives and daughters. Elsewhere, Jews fought with kitchen knives and clubs until overwhelmed by the numbers of attackers. Yechiel Peskin testified that he observed at least 200 Jews gathered in the wine cellar's courtyard, armed with clubs and prepared to fight. Bialik's unpublished notes reported the defenders were about 250 wagon drivers and others engaged in manual labor who were armed with clubs, knives, poles, and some firearms. David reported that on Monday morning, an organized group of Jews easily drove away threatening gangs, but the police and military immediately dispersed the self-defense group, disarmed them, and arrested the leaders. Efforts at large-scale self-defense were not organized by any of the Zionist or socialist groups in Kishinev. Pesach Auerbach, who served as an assistant to both Bialik and David, neither of these gentlemen met each other, which is sort of interesting. They were there at pretty much the same time. Wrote in his own history of the massacre that it was amazing that in certain places where Jews tried to protect themselves, they were safe from the mob's rage. No police or army were present at that time. Armed with clubs and stone, the Jews residing next to Old Bridge ran armed after the ruffians and in this manner their souls and homes survived. Yaakov Bernstein Cohen, a Zionist leader in Kishinev, wrote in his 1946 memoir that young Jews gathered and obtained weapons in various ways, got the butchers at the slaughterhouses and the markets to sharpen knives and axes for self-defense. He also recalled how the police prevented efforts at self-defense by confiscating weapons. Ironically, although the reportage or non-reportage of acts of self-defense is what most distinguishes Bialik and David, upon analysis of what transpired, self-defense becomes a complicated issue. Acts of self-defense documented by David and Auerbach and much later revealed in Bialik's hidden notebooks were arguably less effective than non-aggressive measures taken by victims. In each instance where efforts at self-defense were taken and failed, it aroused greater hostility and violence on the part of the rioters. On the other hand, passive responses, requests for assistance from Gentiles, and attempts to bribe rioters sometimes proved more successful in saving lives. Missing, however, from this analysis is a rising element of Jewish honor, which was to become a critical element in Jabotinsky's Zionist ethos, which he called Hadar, perhaps best symbolized by Joseph Trumpeldor's purportedly stating when he fell in 1920 defending Tel Tai, Tov lamut ba'ad atzinu. Jabotinsky would devote the rest of his life to establishing organizations for Jewish self-defense and self-respect both in Europe and Israel, to instilling Jewish pride in its young people, and to establishing the Zionist vision of a Jewish state in Palestine. For Jabotinsky, the Kishinev Pogrom was not a cause for breastfeeding, rather was a call for an end to the powerlessness of exile and for Jewish self-defense. It was a call that Jews needed to take their destiny in their own hands, and that Jews had no future in an irredeemably anti-Semitic society. The Kishinev Pogrom stimulated a cataclysmic change in Jewish culture and society. It was a watershed event changing how Jewish youth responded to attacks against them. People were no longer willing to accept the physical attacks and the loss of humanity associated with anti-Semitism. Clearly, the largest impact of the Kishinev Pogrom was the westward migration of millions of Jews, leading one contemporary observer to comment that this migration was so great as to overshadow in magnitude the expulsion of the Jews from Spain and to rank with the exodus from Egypt. That was in the Times, in July 19. The pogrom jolted the Jewish intelligentsia in Russia to radicalize their thinking. Achad Ha'am, the Hebrew and Yiddish writer prior to Kishinev, objected to the use of force. But in the wake of the massacre in Bialik's poem, he decried Jewish passivity and cowardice. While blaming the Russian government for complicity in the pogrom and for denying Jews their basic human rights, he also attributes the Jews' alleged failure to defend themselves as a basis of the contempt the rioters had for the Jews. Chaim Weizmann, in his autobiography Trial and Error, noted, perhaps the most tormenting feature of the Kishinev pogrom was the fact that Jews had allowed themselves to be slaughtered like sheep without offering general resistance. Obviously, he read Bialik, not David, but many scholars view Bialik's In the City of Slaughter and its withering denunciation of the alleged passivity of the Jewish victims as a text that galvanized the Jewish movement to organize self-defense groups. Bialik was already widely viewed as a national poet, and he had a key role in disseminating Zionist political thought, Zionism's new man. Instrumental in convincing tens of thousands of Russian Jews to leave for the West or Palestine, the pogrom became a rallying cry for Zionists, inspiring early self-defense leagues under leaders like Zev Jabotinsky, and in the founding of Beitar. Zionist belief in the degradation of exile capitalized on Bialik's depiction of Jewish passivity in Kishinev to shape a national identity predicated on a robust response to physical threats. The belief, knowledge that Russia's officials fomented these attacks would prove decisive in consolidating long-standing Jewish political inclinations, most pronouncedly the marriage in Russia of Jews and the left, and inspired Jewish resistance to the regime and participation in the 1905 revolution. What Kishinev made starkly clear was that the Romanov Russia was beyond repair for Jews. It was the pogrom that provided the ideal focus for Bialik's fierce poetic curse. It would constitute for many the final nail in the coffin of the prospect of Russian Jewish integration. It became the ultimate verdict on the necessity for emigration to the United States of Palestine, while for others it became a clarion call for revolution. Thank you. Anyone has any questions? Oscar.
Yeah, what's amazing to me is this explanation by the Russian Minister of Interior, where he mentions that there was a widespread belief on the part of the Russian peasants that the